The fire was already burning when you opened your eyes. The room was warm. The grate had been swept, the ash removed, the coals arranged and lit with a precision that suggested the fireplace had simply decided, of its own accord, to be ready. The water in the washstand was hot. The curtains were drawn back exactly far enough to admit the pale gray light of a London morning without letting the cold air from the glass reach the bed. Your shoes had been cleaned. Your clothes had been brushed and laid out. The hallway outside your bedroom door was spotless. The carpet swept, the brasswork on the stair rail polished to a reflective finish that caught the gaslight from below. You did not see anyone do any of this. You were not supposed to. Somewhere in this house, right now, there is a girl. She is 16 years old. She has been awake since 4:30. She has already cleaned 3 fireplaces, carried 4 cans of hot water up 2 flights of stairs, swept a hallway, polished a banister, emptied 2 chamber pots, and scrubbed a front doorstep on her hands and knees in the dark. It is now 7 o'clock in the morning, and her working day is slightly less than half finished. You will not see her. If the house is run correctly, you will never see her. Her name does not matter to you, and you will probably not learn it. You may, if you employ her for long enough, learn the name she was given when she was hired, which in some households was not her actual name, but the name of the girl who held the position before her, because the family preferred consistency, and the housemaid's identity was not a variable the household had been designed to accommodate. This is the story of the most common job in Victorian England. By 1891, domestic service was the single largest category of female employment in Britain. Over 1.5 million women worked as domestic servants. The housemaid was the backbone of the operation, the person on whom the visible perfection of the Victorian home entirely depended, and the person the Victorian home was most carefully engineered to make disappear. She carried 3 tons of water up and down stairs every week. She scrubbed floors on her knees until medicine named a condition after her. She was forbidden from being seen, forbidden from being heard, and in some households forbidden from being acknowledged as a human being occupying the same building as the family she served. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what her day looked like, what the house demanded of her body, what the rules did to her mind, and why Victorian England's most essential worker was also its most deliberately invisible person. This is Dreadful History Files, and her story has been waiting to be told for a very long time. There is a version of the Victorian household that survives in period dramas and costume television and the guided tours of country estates. In that version, the servants are background characters with speaking parts, warmly lit below stairs, exchanging gossip over a kitchen table, while a kindly housekeeper dispenses wisdom and a stern butler maintains order. It is a comfortable version. It is also, measured against the documentary record of how these households actually operated, a fiction so thorough that the people it depicts would not have recognized themselves in it. The documentary record tells a different story, and the story begins at a time of day that the family sleeping upstairs would never have witnessed, because the entire point of that story is that they were never supposed to know it was happening. 4:30 in the morning. Winter. London. She slept in the attic. This was standard. The servants' quarters in a Victorian household occupied the spaces the architecture considered least valuable, which were the rooms at the top of the house and the rooms at the bottom. The spaces too cold in winter, too hot in summer, too cramped for anyone whose comfort the building's design had been asked to consider. Her room, if it could be called a room, was small enough that a modern bathroom would offer more floor space. A narrow iron bed, a washstand with a chipped basin, a candle, a chair if she was fortunate. The ceiling followed the pitch of the roof, which meant she could stand upright in the center of the room and not at the edges. The window was small, single-glazed, and in January admitted a cold that settled into the bedding overnight and remained there until she left it. She shared this room. In most households of moderate size, housemaids doubled up, 2 girls to a bed in some cases, which was a practical arrangement that solved a space problem and created the conditions for the kind of enforced intimacy that the household management manuals never discussed because it fell outside the category of things the household considered worth managing. Her comfort was not a line item in any domestic budget. She woke in the dark because there was no alternative. The fires in the family's rooms needed to be lit before the family woke, and the family must never see the fires being lit, because seeing the fire being lit would require seeing the person who lit it. and seeing the person who lit it would shatter the central fiction upon which the entire household operated, which was that the house maintained itself through some elegant mechanism that did not involve human hands or human bodies or human beings on their knees in the cold at 5 o'clock in the morning. The grate came first. Yesterday's ash had to be removed. The grate swept, the fender cleaned, the fire laid with paper and kindling and coal, in the specific arrangement the housekeeper had specified and the household preferred. She did this in the dark or near dark, working by candlelight, moving quietly enough that the person sleeping in the bed behind her did not wake. In a large house with multiple reception rooms and bedrooms, she might clean and lay 5 or 6 fires before the family stirred. Each grate took between 15 and 20 minutes when done properly, which meant that the fires alone could consume the first 90 minutes of her day before anyone she served had opened their eyes. The cleaning that followed was conducted under a single absolute principle. It must be completed before the family appeared. Mrs. Isabella Beaton, whose Book of Household Management published in 1861 became the definitive guide to Victorian domestic operations, was explicit on this point. The cleaning of the kitchen, passages, and stairs must always be over before breakfast, she wrote, so that it may not interfere with the other business of the day. Everything should be ready, and the whole house should wear a comfortable aspect. The phrase comfortable aspect is doing considerable work in that sentence. What it meant in practice was that by the time the first member of the family descended the staircase, every trace of the labor that had produced the comfortable aspect must have been removed, along with the person who had performed it. The house must look as though it had always been this way. The dust had never existed. The ash had never accumulated. The floors had always been clean. The water in the washstand had always been warm. The fiction was total, and maintaining it required that its author vanish before the audience arrived. If you are watching Dreadful History Files for the first time, subscribe now. What follows is the kind of history that the polished surfaces of the past were specifically designed to hide. Stay for it. The front doorstep was scrubbed on hands and knees. This was done before the street was fully awake, partly because the work required the step to be wet and unobstructed, and partly because a housemaid on her knees in full view of the street was a performance the household preferred to keep brief. The doorstep was the threshold between the house's public face and the outside world, and its condition communicated directly and immediately to every visitor, every caller, every passerby, the household's standard of domestic management. A dirty step was a judgment on the mistress. A clean step was a credit to no one in particular, because the person who had cleaned it was not supposed to be visible in the equation. The step was simply clean. It had achieved this state through the kind of self-generating domestic perfection that the comfortable aspect required. The material she scrubbed with was lye soap, an alkaline compound that cleaned effectively and damaged the skin with equal efficiency. Prolonged contact with lye soap stripped the natural oils from the hands and produced cracking, redness, and open splits in the skin that healed slowly, if they healed at all, and reopened every time the hands were immersed again. In winter, when the water was cold and the air was colder, and the cycle of wet and dry repeated itself dozens of times a day, the damage became cumulative. Chilblains, which are painful inflammations of the small blood vessels caused by repeated exposure to cold, followed by warming, were so standard an occupational condition among housemaids that they were mentioned in household guides without alarm, the way one might mention that a particular tool required periodic sharpening. The knees carried their own cost. Scrubbing floors was done on hands and knees because there was no other practical method available, and it was done daily because the household's standard demanded it. The condition that resulted from sustained kneeling on hard surfaces was an inflammation of the bursa in front of the kneecap. Medicine gave it a name. It called it housemaid's knee. The name has survived into modern orthopedic practice, where it is still used. The condition is now associated with carpet layers, plumbers, and gardeners. Its original population, the teenage girls who developed it while scrubbing the floors of houses they would never be permitted to walk through as guests, has been largely forgotten. The name remembers them. Nothing else does. The water was the heaviest part of the day, and the part that no modern description of Victorian service adequately conveys without numbers. Hot water, for the family's washstands, for the baths, for the kitchen, for the laundry, had to be heated on the range in the basement or ground floor kitchen and carried upstairs by hand. A full can of hot water weighed approximately 15 kilograms. The family's bedrooms were on the first and second floors. The kitchen was in the basement. The back stairs, which were the only stairs the housemaid was permitted to use, were narrow, steep, uncarpeted, and in many houses constructed without handrails, or with handrails too low to be useful. The steps were often uneven, because the back stairs had been built quickly and without the precision applied to the grand staircase, and a step that varied by even a centimeter from its neighbors was enough to cause a stumble when the person descending was carrying a full can of water, wearing a long dress, and moving in the near dark of a service corridor that the household had not considered worth lighting properly. A calculation from the 1890s established that the average housemaid carried approximately 3 tons of water up and down stairs every week. 3 tons. That figure bears repeating because it sits so far outside the range of anything a modern person would consider reasonable that it reads initially as an error. It was not an error. It was the documented output of a system that required hot water on multiple floors of a house that had no plumbing above the ground level, served by a girl who was on average 13 or 14 years old, who had in many cases arrived from a rural background where she had been, in the precise language of the historical record, hideously undernourished. She was tiny. Contemporary photographs of Victorian housemaids confirm this with a consistency that makes the 3-ton figure not merely remarkable, but physically alarming. These were small, underfed girls performing the labor of draft animals in houses that were designed to pretend they did not exist. The rules of invisibility were not suggestions, they were regulations, enforced by the housekeeper with the authority the household invested in her, and backed by the threat of dismissal, which in the context of Victorian domestic service carried consequences severe enough to function as a genuine instrument of control. A housemaid dismissed without a character reference, which was the written assessment of her conduct provided by her employer to her next prospective employer, was functionally unemployable. No reference meant no next position. No next position meant no income and no housing simultaneously, since both were tied to the employment. The character reference system meant that a servant's entire working life could be reconstructed through the chain of written assessments that followed her from position to position, each one representing her former employer's judgment of her value, her conduct, and her willingness to perform the role as specified. Employers were not legally required to provide a character reference upon dismissal. This meant that a housemaid who was dismissed for any reason, including reasons that had nothing to do with her competence, could find herself without the single document her next employer would require before considering her application. The rules she operated under, backed by this system of documentary control, were precise. She was required to complete all cleaning in the family areas of the house before the family appeared. She was required to use the back stairs exclusively, even when the back stairs added significant time to every journey. She was required to move through the house in silence, not relative quiet, silence. Mrs. Beaton's instruction that the parlor maid should move about the room as noiselessly as possible, anticipating people's wants by handing them things without being asked for them, and altogether be as quiet as possible, extended to the housemaid with even greater force, because the housemaid's work was dirtier, heavier, and more physically intrusive than the parlor maid's, and therefore more urgent to conceal. If she was encountered by a member of the family while working in a corridor or on a staircase, she was expected to make herself invisible by the fastest available means. In some households, this meant turning to face the wall until the family member had passed, not stepping aside. Turning away entirely, eliminating the possibility of accidental eye contact by eliminating her own visible face from the interaction. In other households, she was expected to retreat through the nearest service door and wait in the corridor behind it until the family area was clear. The goal, stated plainly in the household management literature of the period, was that the servant should complete her work without creating any sensory evidence of her presence. She could be in the room. She could not be noticed in the room. Specific households took this principle to its logical extreme. The Third Lord Crewe decreed that no housemaids were ever to be seen in Crewe Hall, except in chapel. The 10th Duke of Bedford insisted that at Woburn Abbey, no female servant was to be seen after midday on pain of dismissal. The phrase, "on pain of dismissal," meant exactly what it said. A housemaid who was visible to the Duke after 12 o'clock in the afternoon could lose her position, her income, her housing, and her character reference in a single moment, not because she had failed to do her work, but because she had been perceived doing it by a person who had decided that the perception itself was the offense. The logic beneath these rules was not complicated. It was the same logic that governed the architecture of the house itself. A Victorian mansion of any serious ambition was designed as two buildings sharing one roof. The family's world occupied the formal rooms, the grand staircase, the reception areas. The servants' world occupied the back corridors, the service stairs, the basement kitchen, the attic bedrooms. The two worlds were connected only at the specific points where service was required to appear, and the baize door, that green felt-covered barrier positioned between the kitchen corridor and the family areas, was the physical marker of the division. It was not locked. It did not need to be. Its meaning was understood by everyone who passed through it. On one side, you were a person. On the other side, you were staff. And staff existed to produce results without producing evidence of the labor that generated them. The hours were not a matter of dispute because there was no mechanism for disputing them. A housemaid in a middle-class London household in the 1870s rose between 4:30 and 5:30 in the morning, depending on the size of the house and the number of fires to be lit. She worked through the morning cleaning, carrying, scrubbing, and polishing. She served at breakfast if no parlor maid was kept. She cleaned the bedrooms after the family had vacated them, which involved stripping and remaking beds, emptying washstands, sweeping, dusting, and carrying out the chamber pots. She cleaned the reception rooms during the periods when they were not in use, which required a knowledge of the family's daily schedule, precise enough to ensure she was always in the room they had just left and never in the room they were about to enter. She assisted with luncheon service. She completed afternoon cleaning tasks. She assisted with dinner preparation and service. She turned down the beds in the evening. She carried hot water for the evening wash. She retired to her attic room at approximately 10 o'clock at night, or later if the family were entertaining, which could extend the working day to midnight or beyond. That is a working day of 17 to 19 hours, performed 7 days a week, with 1 half-day off per week if the household was generous, 1 full day off per month if the household was exceptionally generous, and no days off at all if the household was neither. There was no annual leave. There was no sick pay. There was no mechanism for reporting exhaustion, illness, or injury that did not carry the risk of being assessed as unsuitable for the position and dismissed. In the most literal sense available, she was not permitted to be unwell. The house did not pause for her body any more than it paused for the dust it generated or the ash its fires produced. Both were problems to be managed by the same person, and the management was expected to proceed without interruption. This is the part of her story that the official histories preferred to leave unrecorded. If you believe that the people who built our world deserve to have their experience remembered honestly, drop a comment below. Tell me what part of this you did not know. Dreadful History Files exists because you show up for the stories that everyone else left out. The food she ate was not the food the family ate. This distinction was maintained with the same precision the household applied to every other boundary between the two worlds it contained. The servants' table received the plainer cuts of meat, the older bread, the lesser quality of everything that the kitchen produced. In households where economy was practiced with particular enthusiasm, the servants ate what the family did not finish, which introduced a dependency between the family's appetite and the servants' nutrition that the household management guides did not acknowledge, and the servants had no mechanism for addressing. She was fed because the house required her to function, and the quality of her food reflected the house's assessment of how much investment her functioning required, which was the minimum consistent with continued performance. Her wages reflected the same calculation. Mrs. Beaton's published wage tables listed the housemaid's annual salary at between £8 and £12 in the lower range and £12 to £20 in the upper range, depending on the size of the establishment and the seniority of the position. An under-housemaid at the bottom of the scale earned approximately £8 per year. Converted to a weekly figure and divided by the hours she actually worked, her effective hourly rate sits below any threshold a modern labor standard would recognize as legal. She received board and lodging alongside her wages, which the household counted as part of her compensation and which she had no ability to refuse or renegotiate, since leaving the position meant losing both income and accommodation simultaneously. Deductions reduced even those modest figures. A servant who broke a household item was required to pay for the replacement from her wages. A servant whose uniform required repair or replacement bore the cost. A servant who was ill and unable to work had no guarantee of continued payment during her absence, and no guarantee that the position would be held for her return. The economic structure of domestic service was designed, with the same thoroughness the household applied to everything else, to ensure that the cost of departure was always higher than the cost of endurance. The housemaid who stayed in a difficult position, who tolerated conditions she would not have chosen, who absorbed treatment she could not challenge, was not demonstrating contentment. She was performing arithmetic. She was not permitted to have what the household called followers, which meant romantic relationships. She was not permitted to receive visitors from outside the household. She was required in many houses to be in her room by a specific hour, regardless of whether her work was finished. She could not marry without leaving service, because a married woman was not considered suitable for residential domestic employment, which meant that the job required her to remain single for as long as she held it, which in many cases meant the entirety of her youth. The personal life she was not permitted to have occupied the same category as the visible face she was required to eliminate when she encountered her employer in a corridor. It was an inconvenient reminder that the mechanism had a person inside it, and the household preferred not to be reminded. What the household did to her body over time is the part of this story that the medical record preserved, not because anyone asked the housemaids what they were experiencing, but because the conditions they developed were consistent and visible enough that medicine eventually had to name them. Housemaid's knee, the inflammation from years of scrubbing on hard floors, chronic back pain from carrying water and coal up narrow staircases, respiratory conditions from inhaling coal dust, soot, and the fumes of the cleaning compounds she worked with daily, skin damage on the hands from lye soap and cold water, chilblains on the fingers and toes from the cycle of freezing attic bedrooms and overheated kitchens, exhaustion so chronic it became her baseline, the state in which she existed permanently, not as an acute condition, but as the temperature at which her body had learned to operate, because no other temperature was available. She arrived at 14. She was small, underfed, and from a background poor enough that the position represented a genuine improvement over her alternatives. The attic room was cold, but it was hers. The food was plain, but it was regular. The work was brutal, but it was work, and work meant survival. And survival in 1870, for a girl without family, education, or capital, meant accepting whatever terms the world offered and finding a way to endure them. She stayed for years, or she stayed for months, and moved to another house and started the same routine with different wallpaper and the same sore knees. She aged inside the system the way people age inside systems, not dramatically, but incrementally. The damage accumulating in joints and lungs, and the specific kind of tiredness that sleep does not fully repair, because the sleep is never long enough, and the bed is never warm enough, and the morning always comes at 4:30, regardless of what the body needs. She left service if she married. She left service if she was dismissed. She left service if her body broke down so thoroughly that the household could no longer extract the labor the arrangement required. She did not leave service with a pension, because pensions did not exist for domestic servants. She did not leave with savings, because the arithmetic of her wages against the deductions and the costs of the few personal items she was permitted to own left almost nothing to accumulate. She left with her character reference, if she was given one, and the specific set of skills the position had taught her, which were the skills of cleaning, carrying, polishing, and disappearing, and which the world outside domestic service did not value at the same rate the household had charged for them. The census recorded her. That is the closest she came to an official existence. A name, an age, a birthplace. The word servant in the column marked occupation. The census did not record her hours. It did not record her wages. It did not record the condition of her knees or the state of her hands, or the number of fires she had cleaned that morning before the enumerator arrived. It recorded that she existed in this house on this date in this capacity, and then it moved to the next line, and the next house, and the next name in the same column with the same word beside it, repeated 1.5 million times across Britain in 1891, the largest single category of female employment in the country, the workforce that made every other Victorian achievement possible, and the workforce that every other Victorian achievement was specifically designed to make you forget was there. The house she cleaned has been photographed. It may be a museum now. Visitors walk through the rooms she scrubbed and admire the molding she dusted, and stand on the floors she polished on her hands and knees at 5 in the morning, while the family slept above her. The guided tour mentions the servants' quarters. It points out the back stairs. It notes the green baize door. What it cannot show you, because the architecture was specifically designed to prevent it, is what it looked like from the other side. The dark corridor, the steep stairs without a handrail, the attic room with the pitched ceiling and the single glazed window and the iron bed she shared with another girl whose name she might or might not have been permitted to keep. She carried 3 tons of water a week up those stairs. She scrubbed those floors until medicine named a disease after her. She lit those fires and emptied those grates and polished that brass and cleaned those steps and fed that house everything it required, every day, for years, in exchange for £8 and a bed in the roof, and the obligation to disappear whenever the people she served appeared. Victorian society called it service. The household manuals called it proper management. The family called it the comfortable aspect. She called it almost nothing, because she had not been given a voice in the account, and the account had not been designed to include one. The next time you walk through a beautifully maintained old house and admire how perfectly everything has been kept, remember that it was not kept by the house. It was kept by a girl who was trained to be invisible and succeeded so completely that history forgot to write her name down. She deserved better than that. Most of them did, and the record they left behind is the record of their absence, which is, if you listen carefully enough, its own kind of testimony. Subscribe to Dreadful History Files. The past was not what they told you it was, and there are more of these stories waiting, behind the doors you were never meant to open.